So today I have the long promised and not delivered first talk of the Faith Mind Sutra. All the talks are online for the whole sutra except the first one, which didn't get recorded. So I'm going to give that again today, and it will be posted, and the whole series will be there for anybody who wants to follow it. I believe, Lawrence, I think that we've also posted the actual sutra online too?
Yes.
Yes, so you can also download the sutra. So today's talk is on the opening lines, and I'll read them to you. The great way is not difficult for those who have no preferences. When love and hate are both absent, everything becomes clear and undisguised. Make the smallest distinction, however, and heaven and earth are set infinitely apart. If you wish to see the truth, then hold to no opinions for or against anything. To set up what you like against what you dislike is the disease of the mind. When the deep meaning of things is not understood, the mind's essential peace is disturbed to no avail. Okay. So this is one of the best loved scriptures in Buddhism. There was a time in Buddhist training when every monk trainee had it by heart. That's why in the koan collections there are at least 5 or 6 different koans that have to do with somebody asking a question about the line of this sutra. Often the first line that says, having no preferences, is translated for those who do not pick and choose. So a lot of the koans have to do with picking and choosing. They've used that translation. This sutra was supposedly written by somebody called Zen in Chinese, Sozan in Japanese. He was the third patriarch. He's known as the third patriarch. He's not the third patriarch from Buddha, because the whole first line of patriarchs are Indian guys, and they have Indian names. He's the third patriarch of the Chinese lineage. So the first person who supposedly went to China and took Zen Buddhism was Bodhidharma. Buddhism was in China before that. They had sutras and so on. But what Bodhidharma supposedly took was zazen, sitting practice, meditation. And so he was the first Chinese patriarch. His successor, the second Chinese patriarch, is called Huike, or sometimes in Japanese called Eika. And he's the guy who stood in the snow up to his knees, begging Bodhidharma to give him instruction, and eventually cut off his arm and gave it to Bodhidharma so that Bodhidharma would see his sincerity of desire to practice. Please don't try that here. And so that was the second patriarch, Huike, and Eika, or Huike's successor, is Sozan, Sengsan, and so he's known as the third Chinese patriarch. An account of his life is given in the Book of Koans called The Transmission of the Light, sometimes translated Transmission of the Lamp. And this is a book that starts with Buddha and then goes and tells the life stories and enlightenment experiences of all the patriarchs up to a certain point. So in these accounts, they tell you something about the person's life. So this is what the Transmission of the Light tells us about Sengsan. That he was a layman. Strike one up for us. He was 40 years old when he met his teacher. That was about the age in which I started practicing. I was 41. And it's said that he was suffering from leprosy. Later, the account tells us that he was cured of this leprosy. I'm not sure if that could be accurate, because I think at that time there was no cure for leprosy. Maybe had some other kind of skin condition. I don't know. I didn't research it, so I don't really know. When he met his teacher, Huike, this teacher was deeply impressed with Seng San's Dharma understanding. He was already had made some headway in the practice by the time he got to this teacher. So Huike immediately had him shave his head and ordained him as a monk. It is Huike who gave him the Dharma name, Seng San. You know, maybe some of you don't know that it's customary to take a different name when you become a monastic. So his name, Seng San, means jewel of the community. My Dharma name is Jikyo. I don't really go by it anymore, but that's what it is. So, you know, jewel of the community, he must have been a red-hot practitioner. Certainly his authorship of this little sutra is, it's kind of a jewel in itself, isn't it? He was transmitted to by this teacher, Huike, and that's how he became a teacher himself and the third patriarch. He lived at a time when there was lots of persecution of Buddhists. In China, it used to be sometimes the emperor was a Buddhist and sometimes he wasn't. And so when the emperor was a Buddhist, all was calm for the Buddhist. But when he wasn't, often the Buddhists would be persecuted, severely killed. There are several stories of masters who had their heads chopped off. So his teacher apparently told him to go hide out in the mountains because of this persecution, and supposedly he remained there for 20 years. These were not wasted years as far as the Dharma goes, according to Transmission of the Light. He transmitted to at least one student, and he wrote, and this is where he supposedly wrote the Faith Mind Sutra. The Transmission of the Light tells us finally that Seng San returned to civilization and continued to teach until he died. Supposedly he died, this is an interesting little factoid, supposedly he died while standing in Gasho under a tree. Isn't that a beautiful picture? So that's what Transmission of the Light tells us. That's the official story. But what we know is that our ancestors, who were so strict in pursuit of spiritual truth, often were not very attached to historical truth. So sometimes they just shaped the stories of people. Either they didn't know or they wanted to make a point by talking about the person's life. We were just talking recently about Chiono, who was supposedly a servant and illiterate, and the historic truth of her is that she was the daughter of a samurai, quite upper class and very well educated. But they like to make the point that, you can be a simple, ordinary person and the Dharma is not out of reach for you. So here we're told a bunch of stuff, we're not sure why, about Seng San, which apparently is not true. Most scholars say that he never actually came out again from the mountains once he went in to hide. That part at least is true. And they also say he did not produce any writings. So that begs the question, if Seng San did not write this, who did? And the scholars have no idea, and so we don't know either. I like to think it's Seng San who gashoed to trees. And since we don't know any better, we can claim that. So currently there are at least 5 or 6 different translations into English of this sutra. They vary quite a bit. They're all online, so if you wanted to go online and compare different lines in different translations, sometimes that's a good way to understand it, because said one way you might not get it, but if you read another translation, you might say, oh, that's what that means. So you could look up the different translations online. There are also a couple of books of commentary in English on this sutra, so you could, they kind of explain it to you and give you background. So you could also go to those if you really want to make a deep study of this sutra. The Chinese title of the sutra is Sin Sin Ming. Sin here means faith. This faith is said to be used not in the sense of faith in something, but faith as the very nature of mind itself. Ming here means some kind of written expression, a sermon, a warning, an admonition. So that's the Chinese title. In English, it's usually known as Faith Mind Sutra, sometimes called Faith in Mind Sutra. So Master Shengyan, who's a Chinese master, also has a lot of followers in the States, says that the mind referred to in this title is Buddha mind. This would be what Suzuki Roshi called big mind. Sometimes it's referred to as universal mind. So this word mind is frequently used in Zen and in all of Buddhism, and we're often confused about what it means when Buddhism talks about mind. This is partly because the same word is often used for the thoughts, the feelings, the sensations that are streaming through our heads at all times. But these thoughts, feelings, and sensations are not what Buddhism means when it talks about mind. They would be what Suzuki Roshi calls small mind. So I often differentiate between these universal mind or big mind and small mind by saying this, that the thoughts, sensations, and feelings, these are the contents of your mind. They're not your mind, they're the contents. And the mind, what Buddhism calls mind or big mind or universal mind, this is the container of all these thoughts, feelings, and sensations. This container is much bigger than the things it contains. In fact, mind, in this sense, contains everything. It is everything. Nothing is left out. Mind pervades the universe. In the sutra, what Suzuki Roshi is calling small mind is referred to as discriminating mind. The mind that makes choices, that compares, that has preferences. So it's useful to make these distinctions in order to be clear about what the sutra is talking about when it says mind, which is a word it uses a lot. If you make this distinction, however, sometimes it can give the false idea that there are two minds, separate minds. It's important to remember, as Sang San points out again and again in the sutra, that ultimately there is only one mind. Buddha mind cannot be found separate from discriminating mind. We can experience Buddha mind only in whatever the momentary experience of our mind is. It's not some abstract thing floating around out there that you can get in touch with. It resides in things. To see into what the Faith Mind Sutra means by mind, we need to remember that mind, like everything else, is ultimately empty. So what does Buddhism mean when it describes mind or anything else as empty? Empty is just the term that Buddhism has chosen to use to point out that everything in the universe is impermanent. Nothing lasts forever. Nothing lasts unchanging. What Buddha saw in his enlightenment is that everything is subject to change. That was what he told everybody in his first sermon. Everything changes. All things are in flux. Nothing stays the same from moment to moment. This seems very obvious. You know, everything changes. Oh, sure, I get that. But to really understand in your bones that nothing can be depended on, that nothing can be counted on to remain the same, this is emotionally earth-shaking. It's shattering, because we live our lives as though things did stay the same, and then we're very upset when they don't sometimes. Furthermore, what Buddha pointed out is that anything that changes cannot be said to be an independent entity. That is, it cannot exist as a separate and isolated thing. It can't stand alone. So how does Buddha arrive at this conclusion from his realization that things change? Here's his reasoning. You know, Buddhism is very logical in a way. Once you buy into the major insights, then it's pretty logical. So he says things exist in the first place because various causes bring them into being. Therefore, he continues, if everything has a cause, there is always something that pre-exists each thing, right? If you can't have a thing that doesn't have a cause, there's always got to be something before. It's like the big question about the Big Bang. What existed before? We don't know. Buddha would say that there had to be something. For this reason, things always exist in conjunction with other things. You always got to have something else. You can't just have one thing, because you always got to have causes. To complicate this situation further, what Buddha saw was that it's not just as simple as one cause, one result. He saw that there is a much more complicated web of causes for each thing, so that it's not just bing bong, you know, cause, effect. There are multiple, you know, because there are multiple things, there are multiple causes and pressures and influences. In Buddhist language, this is called co-arising. Things arise together. They cannot arise all by themselves. Everything arises from a cause, and everything is constantly changing because there's a complex chain of causes which exist over space and over time. This group of insights is how Buddha arrived at the concept of emptiness. If nothing can exist permanently and unchanging without relationship to other things, then everything is empty. What is it empty of? Of permanent, independent being. Thus, things are called empty. What Buddha is saying is that cushion there, it's empty. It's not permanent. We know someday it will wear out. It's not independent. Somebody had to make it. We bought it. So there's this whole web. But that because it's not permanent and because it can't exist without a cause, a maker and a buyer and so on, then we would call it empty. We will understand the beginning passages of the Faith Mind Sutra much more clearly when we realize that the mind it is speaking of is empty mind. It's absolute mind. The sutra is speaking from the point of view of enlightenment. So let's take a look again. This is what it says. The great way is not difficult for those who have no preferences. When love and hate are both absent, everything becomes clear and undisguised. Make the smallest distinction, however, and heaven and earth are set infinitely apart. If you wish to see the truth, then hold no opinions for or against anything. To set up what you like against what you dislike is the disease of the mind. When the deep meaning of things is not understood, the mind's essential peace is disturbed to no avail. So let's look closely at these lines and see what we can make out of them that might speak to us here in 21st century Philadelphia. The first line, the great way is not difficult for those who have no preferences. The great way the sutra speaks of here is the Buddha way, the path. It's not called great because it's some kind of superior teaching. It's called great because it's big. It's big in the sense that it contains everything. It leaves nothing out. This containing everything is used in the sense of Indra's net. Indra's net describes the Buddhist view of the universe, a vast whole, encompassing everyone and everything, holding the whole 10,000 things in one vast connected web, everything reflecting each other, everything influencing each other. Indra's net is a teaching about what the cosmos is like. It's also a teaching about what our lives are like. Everything is a vast gestalt, an inseparable pattern, and you can't have just one thing. That's why Buddhism says all is one. In that sense, all is one. We can think of something separately by abstracting it from the pattern in which it exists. But in reality, we cannot separate a particular thing from the context in which it is embedded. We can think of ourselves as separate, but actually, we would not exist apart from the many causes that have brought us into being. And those causes have shaped our particular way of being. Each of us is the whole universe because we cannot be separated from it. And the whole universe is each of us. So the great way is us and we are the great way. It contains everything and everything is contained in us. Naturally then, the great way is not difficult for us because we are it. This is why the sutra that we chant says, when you walk the way, it is not near, it is not far. It's not near and it's not far because it's you. So it can't be judged in spatial terms because you're it. It's you. But remember that the sutra says the great way is not difficult for those who have no preferences. It doesn't just say it's not difficult. This can be read positively or negatively. It's absolutely true that the great way has no difficulties. Why is this? Because it's never been separate from us. Because we are it. How could the great way be apart from us? It contains everything, including each one of us. But the sutra doesn't let us get away with that comforting news. Our experience tells us that the great way does have difficulties. Why do we experience it as difficult? The second part of the line tells us why. Because we do have preferences. Because, as some other translations put it, we don't avoid picking and choosing. We don't cease to cherish opinions. There's the rub. We are filled with likes and dislikes, preferences, judgments, opinions. And that makes understanding and living the great way difficult. The next line says, when love and hate are both absent, everything becomes clear and undisguised. Everything becomes clear and undisguised, but only, Sang San tells us, when love and hate are both absent. This is sometimes an misunderstood line, because they've used the words love and hate. We may not see the everyday descriptiveness of this line. Because love and hate are extreme forms of having preferences for or against. And usually we don't go around every day loving and hating everything we meet. But we do go around in confusion and cloudiness, liking and disliking, wanting and not wanting, choosing and rejecting every day. This is maybe the core of our self-centeredness, that we judge absolutely everything we experience. Is this good for me or is this bad for me? It's kind of like General Motors in the U.S. What's good for General Motors is good for the country. You know, is this good for General Motors? Is this good for the U.S.? That's what we do. Is this good for me? Do I like this? Is this bad for me? I don't like this. It's just, we do it so automatically we don't even notice it. So it doesn't mean that we can't love our partners and our friends and family. What the sutra is getting at here is more the prejudices, the aversions, the preferences and partialities that we experience during the ordinary events of our lives. All day long we judge every incident in our lives by the standard of want, don't want. This is one of the basic truths that Buddha discovered. How he put it is, desire is the cause of suffering. This desire that he calls desire is this wanting and not wanting. If, as Buddha describes, everything changes, we will inevitably come face to face with things that we desire and can't have, and with things we don't want, but which we are forced to deal. That just goes with the territory of being alive. And it's the judgments we make for or against every moment of our lives that keep us from seeing things clearly, just as they are. We can't see them without prejudice and judgment. You know, yesterday we may have all been saying, oh, drat, you know, it's raining, you know, because we're seeing it from the point of view of ourselves. But maybe the farmer was saying, oh, great, you know. So it's that we judge everything from our own point of view. The next line continues with the same ideas. It says, make the smallest distinction, however, and heaven and earth are set infinitely apart. The sutra points out that the experiences of our lives can be heavenly. You know, they're not positing a place called heaven. They're just using it as a descriptive term. They can be beautiful and abundant, or they can be earthly, full of suffering and want. And depending on whether we can live, as the sutra advises, without making the smallest distinction, that is how our life is, heavenly or hell. To make distinctions, we have to compare things. We have to step outside our experience and make judgments about it. The smallest distinction implies that when we stand apart from our lives in judgment, there is no separating just a little bit. There is no partially separated. There's no hairline crack separated. We are either one with our lives or we are separated from them. There are no degrees of separation. The line tells us that we cannot make even the smallest distinction. When we hear Buddhism talk about desire, we often think of money, sex, material possessions. But we're not just attached to worldly things. We have spiritual attachments also. This is why my teacher, Barry Magid, tells us it's important to regard Zazen as useless. Zazen is not going to get us anywhere different. When we desire enlightenment, it means that we're not satisfied with our present circumstances. It means we reject the moment. No purpose, no goals in practice means having no preferences. If you are deluded, be deluded. Don't chase after enlightenment. It helps to remember that from the ultimate point of view, there is no difference between delusion and enlightenment anyway. Doesn't the Heart Sutra tell us no path, no wisdom, no gain? When we look into ourselves through our Zazen, we see the Buddha's Four Noble Truths revealed in our own experience. We see that everything changes and is therefore impermanent and codependent. If you sit down for 5 minutes on your cushion, you will see that your mind jumps around to 200 different things. Everything changes. We see the suffering of our own lives, and we become sensitive through that to the suffering all around us. We see that the very thing that causes our suffering is our desire for things to be different. We have passionate loves and hates, tepid likes and dislikes. According to them, we make our distinctions. We are for or against things. And heaven and earth are then set infinitely apart. The sutra tells us, if you wish to see the truth, then hold no opinions for or against anything. To set up what you like against what you dislike is the disease of the mind. Our very loves and hates, likes and dislikes, opinions are the disease of the mind, a kind of mental sickness. Sang San is speaking from the point of view of the deepest reality, where there are no distinctions, where everything is the same, equal. Because the reality of life has no distinctions, when we impose distinctions of our own, it's bound to cause pain. Because what we've done is we've put ourselves out of sync with reality. The world is a place we can't pin down, we can't control, but oh, how we try. We always try to arrange our lives just the way we want them, and to do this is a fool's errand. We can't do it, yet we spend so much of our lives trying. The sutra continues, when the deep meaning of things is not understood, the mind's essential peace is disturbed to no avail. What is the deep meaning of things? According to the Faith Mind Sutra, the deep meaning of things is that they are always changing, that they are empty of permanence, that they can't exist independently from each other. These truths mean that we cannot fix our world. Can't stop the world and get off. It's moving, you're moving. We can't arrange it once and for all to our liking. And even if we once managed to get everything set our way, because everything is changing, things would soon be out of sync again. Life is a slippery thing. To try and control it is to disturb the mind's essential peace to no avail. Doesn't work. No avail. We don't have to be disturbed. It is to no avail that we disturb our peace of mind. To regain our peace, we just have to understand the deep meaning of things and the implications that these meanings have for our lives. What are these implications? Stop trying to control what cannot be controlled and doesn't need to be controlled anyway. Just be with again, moment after moment. So are we meant to go through life never able to say what we want, what we like? Are we to be one of those people who, faced with a restaurant menu, can't say what we want? Are we meant to be disengaged and apathetically detached? This is a word that's sometimes used in Buddhism, detachment. That's the other side of the question. And that's another talk.